but I believe it has inadequately served the profession because it tends to breed a culture of heroes and imitators rather than a deep spread culture of reflection. So I have been searching for a model of practice that seeks to be creative without being personality-centric. And the subset of this theme that I'll speak on today is what contemporary practice can learn from traditional craft. Now, I stumbled into this surprisingly not from either reading about craft or about architecture, but about software, and an essay by Eric Raymond called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. And what was interesting in this is that Raymond uses architectural metaphors to talk about two modes of producing software. One which is the dominant mode that we associate with companies like Microsoft, which is closed source. So the source code of all the software that Microsoft produces, only Microsoft knows. It's secret. You can't open the source code of Word or PowerPoint or Windows or anything like that. It's protected, it's copyrighted. And the other is open source, which is like the operating system Linux, which was started by Linus Torvalds, who just put the entire source code on the internet and anyone could work on it and change it and send in their suggestions. And through a series of small incremental suggestions that people have been sending in, this operating system has developed. And actually some open source packages dominate their market, like Apache, which is a software that runs web servers, controls 65% of the servers in the world. There's no other package that comes even close. So Raymond is an evangelist for open source software, and he compares them to the cathedral and the bazaar. So he says the cathedral requires this prior grand vision. The bazaar starts with no final product defined. So just like the actual bazaar, maybe it starts with one stall and then another one comes, and no one in the beginning has predicted what shape the bazaar will take. And that's the way open source also works. High investment versus small, low-cost increments. Concept springs from centralized expertise. Here it evolves over time through decentralized process. There's an exclusive patron, whereas there's an open culture. Now Raymond argues for open source, and a lot of people have interpreted his analysis as arguing for a more open and transparent democracy. But he's very clear that his argument is an instrumental argument and not a moral argument or a political argument. He says it's a better way of producing software. And he uses statements like this: given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. In reading this, I started wondering whether, I started thinking that perhaps there are parallels here between the contemporary architect and the traditional craftsman. So just like the contemporary architect, all ideation is controlled by a personality, whereas the craftsman is anonymous, just as in open source. There is a defined creator, whereas in the craftsman, the boundary between maker, creator is very blurred. It's copyrighted versus a communal tradition. No one owns a copyright for craft. And there's the idea of extreme originality, starting with something new versus incremental adaptation. So I started working on these similarities a little more and came up with this list: that the craft is practiced by a community, design and its innovations belong to the community, incremental innovation is valued over extreme originality, and every innovation is judged on two counts: the utility offered to the task at hand and the enrichment of the community's language. Judgment is based on peer review, and community development is prioritized over personal glorification. Producer and user often belong to the same community, and there's a line that is blurred between utility and aesthetics. And the business model is publish the recipe freely and open a restaurant. Because what you're aiming for is your mastery of cooking. And that's what you do when you go and buy something from a craftsman. You pay for that person's mastery. You don't pay for a copyrighted idea. But the shift from the traditional craftsman to the contemporary artist has involved a radical reorientation that Richard Sennett defined.
which is the traditional craftsman has an outward turn towards community, and the contemporary artist has an inward turn to a reflective self. So the reason for being comes from that internal source of the creative artist self. Whereas the craft workshop may be dominated by a master craftsman, but its reason for being is an outward turn in how it serves the community. And the development of the community is valued over personal glorification, which is why the craftsman is perfectly content to remain anonymous. Now this indicates a radical change in the two systems of operation, because the singular orientation of the artist means a simplistic, singular self, whereas a craftsman's embeddedness within
community means complexity. So I started looking into the whole question of complexity, and culture is a complex phenomenon, and started getting into the theory of complexity, which is a theory that has really developed over the last 2 to 3 decades. And culture is what the philosopher Michael Polanyi defined as a polycentric system. It has multiple centers. And he explains it with a metaphor of a spider's web. As a cultural entity, I might be just on a single strand of the web, and I might pull on the strand and change the tension in that strand. And I think I'm dealing with just that strand, but actually what is happening is the tensions across the entire web are getting redistributed in some form. So you don't know what impact you have what you're doing. It's a nonlinear system. This is a mathematical term which means the output is not proportional to the input. Linear systems, you put in a small input, you get a small output. Large input, large output. But in nonlinear, you can have a small input that has a huge output. So in culture, sometimes one person's idea has a radical change, causes a radical change. Now, pre-structured processes that centralize decision-making are poorly suited to tackle polycentric challenges. This is something pointed out by the legal philosopher Lon Fuller, who said, law is very badly suited to resolve culture. That law might be built on the foundation of community, but law cannot be used to construct community. So, polycentric challenges really require polycentric methods, and given the singularity of the contemporary artist, there is the odds of a disconnect between that artist's work and culture as a whole are very high. The nature of kinds of complex systems was explained by a scientist, Warren Weaver, way back in the 1950s. And this I came to know because Jane Jacobs cites it in her book on cities, especially a chapter called What Kind of a Problem is a City? And she uses Weaver's analysis to answer that question. And Weaver said there are 3 kinds of problems. There's organized simplicity, which just has a few variables. You can describe it through a conceptual model. And the example in science is Newtonian mechanics, which tries in a few laws to describe how the whole universe moves. So this is in the cultural context, this is the equivalent of the solitary artist, who's a singularity. The person's philosophy, way of working is a singularity. The other, he said, is disorganized complexity, where there are many variables, and you can't reduce it to a conceptual model. You can only understand it through statistical techniques. So quantum mechanics, which works through probability theory, climate science, these are all large nonlinear systems that work only through probability theory or other statistical techniques. But Weaver said there's a third kind which is inadequately studied, which he said organized complexity. And he means self-organized. So there are many variables, but organization emerges from interaction of the parts. So the system is self-organizing, and living systems follow this. But the challenge here is that when it's self-organizing, you can't say what's going to happen. You can just lay conditions for it coming up, but you can't determine it like you could in a linear system. So self-organizing systems display a capacity called emergence, which is the capacity of a system to exhibit fundamental core properties that could not be observed in an earlier state of the system. In biology, one of the prime examples given is the termites nest. These are huge megastructures. If you resolve one of these nests to human scale, it would be equivalent to a human megastructure that might be 2 or 3 kilometers wide and maybe 3 or 4 kilometers high. And they're highly resolved efficiently. You might think it's just a piece of random pile of mud, but actually you analyze it, you find they have functional resolution, climate control, waste disposal, and highly efficient systems that you would normally associate only with master plan systems. Except biologists could never find a master planner termite. And then they discovered over time that there was no master planner termite. Actually, what happens is when a termite moves, it exudes a chemical trail called a kind of chemical called a pheromone. And the termites that move afterwards can sense the pattern of the termites that have moved before. And there are a few genetically programmed rules saying if you smell a pheromone trail like this, then put a piece of mud like that. And the system evolves just from these rules. So if you look at the conditions, there's frequent and high synchrony interaction. Every action leaves a trace. And there's an ingrained impulse to recognize patterns in the traces. There are high levels of information symmetry because everything is in the public domain, so everyone knows everything. There are no secrets. And this is important. There's a low preoccupation with grand design and a focus on immediate experience. You're not trying to say what's eventually going to happen.
What's the interaction I'm having right now? And if you try and focus on the grand design, you actually lose sight of the immediate experience. Stephen Johnson, who's written a book on Emergence, looking at how, which describes anything from ant colonies to software to cities. And he says our brain is also an emergent system. It has millions of neurons, and each one is just trying to connect with the others. And if each neuron sought to be
individually, have individual free will, then the brain would cease to function. It's just trying to establish connections. And the system evolves through iterative evolutionary spirals. So you first recognize a pattern, then a pattern in the patterns, and then further meta patterns, etc. Now this might sound very scientific, but it's actually the way we live. And we come across everyday examples. Like friendship. If you sought to find friends by first constructing a philosophy of friendship or a project plan for friendships, you'd probably not have friends. You have friends because you just sit and talk to them, and you find what is in common, and you find there's a pattern in things you share in common, and there are traces which are memories of the interaction, and then you build on that, and the friendship evolves that way. So then you have love, you have harmonies, community, but it's the same thing with traditional craft. The craftsman is not trying to be an extremely innovative, original thing, trying to change a person, trying to change things. He or she is just immersed in the immediate mastery of that task.
Accepting what has come, just making incremental changes. And through that, it produces a level of mastery which shows the effectiveness of emergence, that these kind of beautiful works come up. And you also see it in the traditional city. If you look at people who have, tourists who travel to see places, and you leave aside by going to see a specific monument, or they're going to see a precinct, or a zone in a city, you find that they tend to go only to traditional cities. It's very rare that the modern city as a precinct attracts tourists. So that shows that there's a certain value that comes up through this, and all these cities like shown in the images here did not come up through a master plan. They actually came up through these kind of emergent principles. They evolved over time. So in this emergence, one has to think, when we connect it back to our field, what the purpose of art is as a whole, because architecture is one of the arts. Now we tend to look at art in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that we have lower level needs, and we need to conquer those needs, and art is one of those upper level needs that belongs in the top portion of the pyramid. And that has bred an attitude that art is a luxury. You first, need to sort out the basics of food, clothing, and shelter, and then if you have money left over, maybe you can buy art. And then art gets displaced into the rarefied walls of the museum and the gallery. But this is an attitude we see in big cities. But if you look at the reality of South Asia, you actually find something very different. It's actually that themselves. So these people did not delegate understanding of the universe to some specialist like a scientist. They needed to understand it themselves. And so they came up with diagrams like this, which is a traditional art in southern India. It's called Rangoli or Kollam in Tamil Nadu. And it's done in all festivals, and sometimes some houses do it every day. And these are reconstructions of the cosmos. And
understanding the universe that you inhabit. So you don't need someone, scientist just constructing their theories isolated within academia. You build your understanding yourself of your work. And because you're doing this, there isn't a separation between objects of use and objects of contemplation. So even if you're making a vegetable crater, you animate it in some way so that it relates to the world that you inhabit. Now, the problem that is happening in this is that the craftsman is beginning to get isolated. Because earlier craftsmen and community were bound by an intimate geography of recognition and shared ritual. But now the craftsman's product is bought by distant individuals who the craftsman does not recognize. I remember I was part of a workshop once which involved designers and artists and traditional craftsmen. And there was this one person who was an embroidery craftsman from Gujarat. And he said that earlier craft operated by, there's a word in Hindi, pehchan. I don't know if you have the equivalent word in Bangla, but by recognition, he recognized who he was selling to. Because he sold in his own village or just nearby villages. And there was a common
understanding of making the world, which is crafts are. But if he says now I'm making something and it goes up and someone in Delhi or New York is buying it and I don't know what they want. And I want to know what the market wants. And the feedback we got is that the people in the market, the so-called market you're describing, feel they're leading impoverished lives and for beauty in their lives they're depending on you. So each side is looking for leadership from the other, and there's this disconnect that is beginning to happen. And the problem is that the purchase of the craftsman's product is now quite often for decorative rather than existential reasons. It's not for making sense of the universe. It's just because it looks good. So the craftsman is gradually being cut off from his or her primary source of renewal. So craft is on the decline for economic reasons, but where it has survived, it's also struggling in its quality for existential reasons, because the disconnect is beginning to happen. So I think we have to do what Charles Correa suggested, that we look at transfers rather than transformations. He said only a decadent culture looks obsessively at its past. To literally replicate the past is to attempt a transfer. And very architecture must be an agent of change and attempt transformation rather than transfer. So one must find forms that are new, agents of positive change, yet built on the wisdom of the past.
So we can't just have a nostalgic age that seeks to replicate the traditional craftsman when the modern world is globalizing and changing fast. So we must go beyond instrumental arguments and seek deeper transcendental principles. And to do this, we must delve into the question of consciousness. So here I'll start with the work of the philosopher Thomas Nagel, who said that we are all aware of the limits of our own bodies. We realize that we inhabit a world that is much larger than us, and that world is imbued with meaning and purpose, which you cannot deny. So we seek to achieve an understanding that is beyond ourselves. So what he calls perspectival ascent, that we seek a higher perspective. We are driven towards that. And we tend to think we can seek that higher perspective through scientific objectivity, because that is scientific objectivity is supposedly a perspective that is free from an individual. It's neutral. But he says in scientific objectivity, we just look at reason and we lose touch with consciousness. And consciousness is something that has a full range beyond the rational mind. It's an awareness of being alive, emotion, dreams, archetypes, a sense of meaning and purpose, and other dimensions that tend to be sidelined by scientific objectivity. So Nagel says to know something objectively is extremely useful and productive But it is a philosophical error to assume that therefore we know it either better or adequately. And what results is a fragmented self, because in scientific objectivity, we leave the feeling self behind and we just put the thinking self forward. And when we've understood it and we seek to reintegrate the self, we have a problem. Now this is a problem that we find a lot in conventional education also, which depends on discussion, so only it relies on what can be articulated and rationalized and intellectualized. So there's an implicit message in many colleges which say, when you're coming into the college, leave your feeling self at the door and only bring your thinking self inside. So we need a new kind of consciousness, and we need what Morris Berman identified as a consciousness that has existed in traditional societies throughout history, what he calls a participating consciousness. A consciousness that realizes that the universe also has consciousness, and our consciousness has to be a part of that universal consciousness. We create a problem for ourselves by believing our consciousness is something that exists by itself. So this was not a problem in earlier pre-modern times, because the universe was seen as alive. And tradition saw the world as enchanted, imbued with divine spirit. And it was that kind of participating consciousness that led to a craft which said a vegetable later must be alive like an animal. But that tradition no longer exists, and we must seek new ways to acquire a participating consciousness. Berman's argument is that we simultaneously exist at multiple levels. So when we communicate, we also meta-communicate. We might say something, but our words also speak of whether we are angry or sad or emotional or loving. So we communicate at multiple levels, and this formal logic actually prohibits something existing at two levels at the same time. But Berman says we need to recognize that we do exist at multiple levels and incorporate that into our being. So I started looking at how craft embodies this participating consciousness. And I looked at 4 dimensions of this and certain sub-themes in those 4 dimensions. So first is what I call embodied cognition. That cognition is not just something intellectual, it's embodied, it's in the entire body and beyond the body. So the first level of understanding is that it's our body and all our senses that are involved in this. There's a wonderful story that the Indian scholar of craft, Jyotirndra Jain, tells of taking an American textile designer to visit a resist-dying craftsman in Rajasthan. And this American designer saw a shade of red that fascinated her. And she asked the craftsman, what is the formula of the vegetable dyes you use to achieve this shade of red? And Jain was acting as a translator, so he first translated that question literally. And the craftsman was not answering, and then this American woman thought that perhaps it's, he wants to keep it a secret. He wants to copyright it or something like that. But Jain realized that he was not answering because he could comprehend the question. That question didn't exist in his universe. So he then intervened and he said to the American, let him answer in his own terms, not in terms of the question you have posed. So once he was given the freedom to do so, the craftsman took a series of dyes, put them in a bowl, started mixing them, and he was not looking at what he was mixing. You could tell he was judging by the sensation in his fingertips. And then, now and then he'd lift up the bowl, he'd smell it. Sometimes he'd take a little bit and taste it. He'd keep adjusting the mixture, adding more water, more powder. And then finally, there was a final tasting and he said, this is that red. So there is a process that you can't put it outside your body like in a formula. Your whole body has to be involved in this judgment. And as a result, then you have to validate by the experiencing body. So this is actually quite important, that we validate everything by our body, and our theorizing is actually a way of just making sure our body doesn't fall into habit. Because habit is an anesthetic. We stop seeing when we start doing something habitually. We don't realize, we lose the ability
to define, to judge carefully. So when we validate through our body, then that's actually the level at which we live in our full authenticity, in our full consciousness. And that validation is important. should critique that bodily validation so it doesn't degenerate into habit, but habit should also anchor that theorizing so it doesn't degenerate into abstraction. And it's that back and forth that has to move. And the validation sometimes has a certain
which it shapes what we're doing. The architect Vijay Jain talks about how some of the carpenters he works with in making the houses he designs, that the posture they adopt in the way they work affects the kind of work they can do. And he says when he tries working that way, he just can't, because his body cannot squat for more than 5 minutes, whereas they squat for the whole day working. So there's a whole bodily posture, sometimes a bodily movement, a memory in the muscles that validates what one is doing. And once it's validated by the body, it automatically human scale begins to come in. You don't do abstract things. So you see this doorway in this is in Tughlakabad, and there is perhaps a frame you see which works to a scale when you're say 100 meters away, and you come a little closer and there's a next level of scale, and then there's a next level of scale. And finding the doorway you pass through is relatable to the scale of your body. You can look at the doorway and say, okay man, that's maybe about 5 people wide and 3 people high. And when you're working this way, you don't lose, this is a lost art in modern architecture. You don't know what is often done in modern architecture. You just take a single material and stretch it across multiple levels without a break. But the embodied self also changes our relationship with the things we make and how we see them. Juhani Palasma says that we have tended to privilege vision in architecture, not just vision, but a very specific kind of vision, which is central focused vision. And central focused vision creates a distance between object and spectator, whereas peripheral vision tends to locate us, immerse us within space. But our way of designing privileges focused vision. So because of that, we tend to pick up the precise delineation of form that focused vision picks up, and may tend to not think enough of the gradations of scale and texture that peripheral vision picks up. But there's another important corollary of this, which is that if you look at these two images and you ask where is the observer in relationship to the work being observed, and in the image on the left, the position of the observer is irrelevant, it's not implicated in the work. But in the image on the right, the position of the observer is implicated in the work. And because we have tended to work this way, and when we are judging in our head, when we are designing, we tend to accept an observer who's in some neutral, undefined territory. And I believe the acceptance of that position of the observer is what has led to a great extent to the degradation of the urban environments we envision, has led to a disconnect that is creating unsustainable patterns of development. And so we actually have to look at this sort of immersion to realize that when we work, there is never any outside. You should not accept an outside to your work that is not implicated in your work. There are only hierarchies of inside. So the next dimension I looked at was the idea of material consciousness, that we are not only conscious, material is also conscious. And first is what Pogani in one of his works defines as focal awareness. So like when I'm hammering a nail, the sensation I feel is actually the handle against my palm and my fingers. That's the primary sensation I'm feeling. But my attention is on the tip of the nail. In fact, it has moved beyond my body. And so that focal awareness is something that is developed over time through practice in these sort of bodily actions. So the craftsman, is working and he feels a sensation of the brush, but his attention is where the brush is touching the painting. And this leads to what I call bridges to otherness. That sensitivity gradually moves out to the extremities, to the fingertips, the nostrils, the tip of the tongue, and beyond. Because of focal awareness, it can move beyond the body also. And that becomes a way of cognition and judgment. And then once you do that, once it has moved beyond the body, you realize that you are in a universe that is alive, and you have to respect that life. So if you're carving wood, you realize that carving against the grain and carving along the grain are very different, because that's the nature of the life of the wood. And then you have to start respecting the life of wood. And that starts dictating the tectonics of what you're doing. Whereas, I quite often attend student crits and I ask them what's the material, and they say we haven't thought of it as yet. This is the spatial organization of my concept. I haven't thought about material. But actually the tectonic logic of what you work with, to understand how wood behaves, to understand how certain things behave. In fact, I look back at my architecture education, and although I complained a lot at the time when I was in first year, I'm so grateful now that we had workshop. We actually had to do some of this stuff. And to realize that because of the training, I have a sense of how it is to run a saw along the grain or against the grain, and how wood smells when you do both. So those things make a big difference. So you realize that the universe is alive. And then because of that bodily engagement, you develop a reduced hesitancy. So here I use the example of playing the sitar. And when you play the sitar over time, you develop these sort of deep, rich calluses in your hand. And until you develop those calluses, playing the sitar is actually quite painful. So you might think once you have developed the callus, you have actually decreased the sensitivity in your finger. But it's actually the reverse. This is something that Sennett points out, that what the callus does for you is it reduces your hesitancy. And that reduced hesitancy allows you to explore more subtle differences. So as Sennett puts it, the callus is to the hand what the zoom lens is to the camera. So because of that, the sitar can explore these sitarists can explore these subtle microtones of expression. The next thing is mastery through repetition. And repetition is a very important aspect of the craft mode, because they're not looking at extreme originality. And one acquires mastery because through the processes of repetition. Soetsu Yanagi, a Japanese scholar of craft, says that the craftsman accepted the picture of life as it was given to him, with its balance of good and evil under heaven, without question or protest. Now, while this did have its problems, a lack of critique of many of the evils of the status quo, it started with a recognition of the world as a live contextual field that had to be respected. And this was very much against the modern avant-garde ethos which says the world is a blank canvas in which I can do anything. And because you're working with the process of repetition, you start to understand subtlety. Now this has been explained by the metaphor of a medical student learning how to read an X-ray. The first time they look at an X-ray, they don't understand anything, it's just a pattern. But then gradually they start seeing more and more, and eventually a skilled radiologist can trace years of history of medical problems by looking at an X-ray. So similarly, it's this repeated looking of the same thing because of incremental innovation that the craftsman acquires that sense of subtlety and therefore can create works of great and extreme mastery. And this subtlety is highly important. Think of the difference between two musicians, both of whom are professionally trained. One is good and one is truly great. The good musician will also be tuneful, faithful to the composition, etc. But it's actually in very subtle differences of microtone and timing that the great musician breaks away into a completely different and magical realm. The other thing, and this connects back to Raymond's arguments about how complex systems are more suitable and are more efficient, is that because there's a gradual adaptation, the cultural fit is stronger. Christopher Alexander writes on this in his first book, Notes on the Synthesis of Form, and he gives the example of a traditional Indian village house. And he says that why is it that it has such a good fit between its form and its culture and its climate. And that's because the house, the architecture of that house evolved gradually over time, just taking one variable at a time. And because of that, it achieved this fit. Whereas in modern design, we try to tackle all the variables at once. And that's a difficult ask. Because it is based on repetition, it's based on the idea of pattern and the recognition of pattern, and this forms a strong part of it. And pattern is this also comes from Yanagi's writing. He says pattern is a way of becoming sensitive to nature, for pattern is inherent to nature. Not the absolute perfection of mathematical pattern, but the roughness of natural pattern. So these uses of pattern, if you actually look into them, it's not a perfect mathematical repetition. Each part is slightly variant, but still you get the sense of the pattern. So Yanagi writes, pattern is nature seen in the best light. By a pattern, we see nature at its most wondrous. In a sense, an age without good pattern is an age that does not look at nature carefully. A country without pattern is an ugly country, a country that does not care for beauty. And finally, there is unself-conscious mastery, and this is also something that Yanagi writes on. He talks about a Buddhist ideal which says that there are two ways of achieving beauty and enlightenment. There is the hard way, which is the way of self-power, and this requires genius. And only a few people are born with that genius, and they can rule through their self-power. So does that mean there is no hope for the masses? And yet Yanagi says no, because the masses take what is called the easy way or reliance on another power. They rely on an external grace. The analogy he gives is comparing climbing a mountain where you depend on your own power, and it's very difficult and energy sapping, versus a sailboat which fills its sail with the grace of the wind. So those who follow other power accept their smallness and surrender to what is greater. Those who follow self-power seek their own greatness. And contemporary training teaches us to seek this path of self-power. So because of this reliance on other power, on external grace, on larger forces than the person who's creating a work of art or craft, a craftsman is gradually, over time, a craft community is able to achieve these amazing kinds of work. And finally, there is communal tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is knowledge that is beyond our capacity to describe. Like riding a bicycle, you can't explain it. It's a memory that lives in your body. And everything that is valuable, that is transcendental, whether you're talking about beauty or love or emotion of any kind, you find your description is always inadequate to what you're feeling. So tacit knowledge is very important to us. It's not recognized adequately in formal education. But the craft community takes tacit knowledge to the level of a community, not just an individual. So they discover authenticity through dialogue. As the philosopher Charles Taylor said, like language, we have the capacity is inborn within us, but we will not realize language till we indulge in conversation. So authenticity is the same. So that immersion in a craft workshop over time makes you realize something. And it's not just dialogue with other humans. It's also dialogue perhaps of listening to the rhythm of the hammering on the metal. And from that rhythm you also learn something about how you should work. And there are ways of spreading tacit knowledge which has been explained by these management thinkers who studied actually Japanese organizations which depend a lot on tacit knowledge. So he said first there's a period of socialization where you're aware of the tacit knowledge of the other. And the first step towards tacit knowledge is the willingness to just spend concentrated time in the same space as the knowledge. It's not an immediate explanation or an understanding. It requires that investment in time. Then there's a process of externalization where the tacit knowledge gets coded in certain protocols of practice. Like the musician who says you must do riyaz. So those, or maybe there are certain principles that are laid out, certain treatises. And then those treatises are distributed. But eventually there are certain protocols of practice, rigors of practice, where it goes back into tacit knowledge and it takes the tacit knowledge to a new level. The presence of the master is important because a lot of this is a patient process of just doing the work and learning. It's So the master is not just someone who teaches, but the master is a symbol of what's worth it at the end. Because you have to do lots of practice, and eventually there's a moment of revelation or epiphany where you discover your own mastery. But to sustain faith through that, to be able to look at the master who's in the same workshop, helps you to see the light at the end of the tunnel and says, this is why the hard work is worth it. And as Sennett says, anyone can become a good craftsman, because learning a craft is like learning through play, and all children know how to play very well. So what it requires is, first you learn and you accept the rules. Then you keep playing the games till the limits of the rules are reached. Then you experiment with a few changes in the rules. And all through this you sustain the social bonds that allow both exploration of the rules and the playing of the game itself. So that way of children playing is also the way that the craftsman learns. But one of the most important points is that autonomy is recycled. When the apprentice joins a master's workshop, it is under the understanding that that apprentice seeks to become a master one day. That's understood by both the apprentice and the master, because it is accepted that creativity is not a single person's possession. The creative idiom is not a single person's possession. Now this is very different from the contemporary architect's or artist studio. The architect might have other people working there, but when that architect stops working, then the studio dies. And this is something that started in the Renaissance when individual signatures to work started. And eventually creativity was treated as a personal possession rather than an empowering spirit. And by the 17th century in Europe, this had also affected the craft studio. So for example, the studio of Stradivari, which is famous for making violins, because Chandavarkar put his signature on the violin, he held his own tacit knowledge very closely to himself. And after he died, even his own sons could not produce the same degree of mastery. Now the process has gone much further. It's an accepted practice that creativity in a studio ends with the end of the personality of the main creator. So to conclude, how does this shape the way we should think about architecture today? I would say that this recycling of autonomy and expertise exists in what I call a mythic imagination. And this I picked from the explanation of myth by the French philosopher Jean-Francis Lyotard. And he gives the example that
So there is no privileged position of expertise. It is continuously recycled, and each one of us knows that we can occupy all three positions of teller, listener, and story. And we tend to shift between those positions. So because of this, the rhythm of a periodic retelling is as significant as the rhythm of periodic retelling is as significant as the accent of a specific telling. And when I'm repeating the myth, it takes on a different shape because we know that it is not just this one-off story, but there is a certain rhythm that has been repeated in the past and will be repeated in the future. A.K. Ramanujan, in studying myths, in studying the Ramayana, says that he prefers the word telling to the usual term, and he's looking at how many different. He says people say there are so many different versions of the Ramayana. In some, Ravana is the hero. So he tells us saying that we tend to say versions of the Ramayana, but he says I prefer the word telling, because a version tends to imply that there is a single authentic original, whereas the telling doesn't imply that. And what he says is that what is important is not the authenticity of an original, but how we transform ourselves in a telling. It's not some original meaning of the Ramayana. Do you get transformed yourself? Are you changed when you read or you listen to it? And this is something that the other scholar of myth, Joseph Campbell, picks up when he says we don't look at, people say we're searching for meaning in life, But he says he doesn't agree with that. He says what we are actually seeking is the experience of being alive. And when that experience resonates with our innermost core of being, and when it seems to resonate with the sort of essence of the universe, then he says that escalates to not just being alive, but the rapture of being alive. And that is what we really seek. So connecting back finally, one is trying to do is to what architectural practice should do. The first is it should be validation by the body. And I'm not talking just about an abstract scale like Corbusier's modular. I'm talking about the complete experiencing body in the richness of its first-person consciousness that thinks, feels, dances, uses all of its senses and is completely aware. And this is the foundation of how we must validate what we do. If we are designing a space, perhaps we should mark it out and pace the space and think about, full scale and get a sense of what it is like. If we theorize, it is to critique and extend the consciousness of the body so that it does not become anesthetized by habit. Theory is not a substitute form of validation. The ultimate validation has to be the body. And this means that the body has also to be brought into the process of creation. So the importance of hand drawing, physical models, these things are important also, because our memory is not just in our head, it's also in our muscles. You learn how to ride a bicycle because the memory of balance starts living in your muscles. And similarly in drawing, you start developing a certain way of understanding because there's a memory of how you draw that resides in your hand. And the short repetitive movements that are involved in operating a computer are not sufficient to build muscle memory. So we need to bring our body into all of these processes. So rather than everything springing from a personality, the resonance that we find in others, just as we develop our friendships because of the resonance we find in others, that should be a crucial mode in practice also. It should be the discussions within a practice that energize it. We should start recovering a sense of pattern, and typology perhaps is the architectural basis on which we can found a sense of pattern. We need to realize that we're immersed in space forever. There is no outside. There are only hierarchies of inside. And because we deal with limited projects that have edges, and we don't control what happens beyond that edge, we have to look at how we treat the edges of the project so it gives this sense of a participating consciousness that is always inside a live universe. So we have to think of the nature of light, of using landscape along the edges in a way that this connects with something greater. This is in projects where you don't have the luxury of a long vista. We need to seek the notion of stillness, and this is achieved in architecture when the spirit of the detail and the spirit of the whole echo the same spirit. And then you get that stillness and repose because you see the same spirit whichever way your body or gaze moves. And I started looking at some contemporary architects who have achieved this. And I started looking at Frank Lloyd Wright or Carlos Scarpa or Jeffrey Bava, Tadao Ando. And I find a curious thing in these examples is that these are people who are internationally recognized as masters, but unlike most of the other masters, they do not have schools of followers and imitators. Because theirs is a rigor, because it looks at this entire range across scales, that there is no shortcut, there is no ism to follow. You must go through the rigor of discovery yourself. We must understand how our work is also alive and is not just dependent on our voice forever standing next to it and saying what it means. So our work should have an aura, a character, because we are used to speaking about our work. Perhaps that starts from our education, where we're always explaining our work to a faculty member, defending it to a jury. So we feel our voice is always next to the work, and the meaning in the work is a result of our intentions. But the meaning in the work actually comes from the aura that springs from the work and the dialogue the inhabitant has with that aura, and that dialogue builds memories which make the work meaningful over time. And finally, we need to develop protocols of practice that keep us immersed in this greater reality beyond ourselves. A wonderful example of this is the Japanese potter Shoji Hamada, who had two kilns. One of them was small and one was enormous. And the large kiln was so large that he could not fill it with his own work. To fire that kiln, he had to collaborate with other potters. And when he was asked, why do you have this large kiln? He said, if I only had the small kiln, I would start thinking that pottery is my possession. But the large kiln reminds me that pottery is something that is greater than I am, and I survive through its grace. I think this idea was, these kind of ideas were best expressed by Louis Kahn. And there's a wonderful story about how he was talking to some students, and he said, architecture is, and then he stopped. And the students thought he's searching for the next word. But actually to Kahn, it was a complete sentence. Architecture is. And what he was saying is that the spirit of architecture is eternal, and each work is an offering to that eternal spirit. And it is only the work of architecture that has presence and gives you a hint of what that spirit is. So architecture is always greater than the architect. And a lot of that spirit is tacit, it's immeasurable. And we have to accept that immeasurability. And it resides in the consciousness of things beyond us and the materials we work with. And not just the materiality of concrete or brick, but even the sort of consciousness of light and of nature. As he says in this statement, how wonderful it could be if we could capture the consciousness of a rose. But we become insecure in the way we are trained to accept this immeasurability. And we start seeking an ascent through an intellectual objectivity because of that anxiousness when confronted with the immeasurable. And we seek to make it tangible through analysis, critique, or measurement. But that actually distracts us. As René Magritte, the artist, said, when we try to analyze what we are doing, our attention goes to the question we have raised and not the thing we are making. And our attention should remain within the thing we are making. So as he says, one cannot speak about mystery, one must be seized by it. So we need to redefine architectural practice. We tend to see it as an instrument for the expression of individual creative genius. And this is a definition we must reject, not because it is wrong, it is right, but because it is insufficient. And the complete definition should be that the practice is a place where our consciousness participates so that we may be seized by the mystery of architecture to lay the ground for others to be seized by this mystery. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the beautiful presentation. We would now go for some questions from the audience, if anybody has any question.
There's a hand raised here.
Hello?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jannati, and I had a question about the thing you said about a woman trekking a lot of distance with this pottery that was decorated with colors or something like that. I think you said something about art being essential part of their life, something like that, and not being a luxury. But I think I work with the indigenous people here and their crafts, so I think, in my opinion, art is something that you do when you have time. For example, if the person did not have the time after her lunch or something like that, she would not have done that much details on a pottery that she uses just to bring water. I mean, for example, the people I work with in the mountains here, the details of their work depends on how much free time they have. I mean, if it was, if I'm talking about the space stations not competing with each other, they would probably draw rangolis on rockets. So I think art is a lot of being free to do it.
Yeah, there is a point to that, and I think in a short span of a lecture, when you're trying to make a point, you wind up being simplistic about what are really complex and nuanced realities. Yes, it is a lot to do with time, but I think what is unquestionable is those people are much more embedded with art compared to urban societies, affluent urban societies. Affluent urban societies, it's very rare to come across people who are also producers of art. So the fact, I mean, I know that if I want a rangoli drawn in my house during Diwali, I will have to ask the maidservant to do it. No one in my family will know how to do it. And that is also going because they've migrated to the towns over generations now. But so it's not to say that every one of them is perfectly embedded in art, but they are much more embedded in art. And you also have to take into the fact that many of them have had disruptions in their traditional life because of what has happened now. So probably I gave the example of the woman trekking for water, but because of disruptive patterns of development that have not been caused by them, the trek for water has become much longer. So perhaps they have less time, and that impacts the extent to which she can decorate her pots. But I just make that to say that, to counter the point that the belief that art is a luxury, and the fact that actually the societies whose struggle for survival is most precarious are more embedded in art. I'm not saying they're perfectly embedded in art, but are more embedded in art than societies that become affluent. So I don't accept this point that art is a luxury.
Do we have any more questions?
Thank you, Prem. I'm Salahuddin, practicing architect. Now I'm a bit ashamed to say that I'm an architect. But I think your lecture validates or revalidates some of the things I personally think is very important in the practice of architecture. And architecture, I think it's not a one person's approach. It becomes a work of architecture when variety of minds get together and sort of experience in a similar ways. And I think your lecture is very much due, at least where I stand as a practitioner. More and more academia are focusing the other way around. So I wonder, the degeneration generated cities that we live in, perhaps one of the reasons that our understanding of living is very different. And in this rat race of looking at life, perhaps got so deeply ingrained in our singular mind. So when you talked about the termite, it doesn't have a master plan, but each termite knows how to move and what to do because someone left a trail or marking. And it points out one thing for me, that no individual mind can think of the greater understanding of living. So I think it would be good to have you back in some form for longer term and really look at elements like termites and really look at things deeply to come up with some sort of inquiries and not an answer perhaps. So I'm very much happy to be a part of this lecture series tonight, and really is a hair-raising understanding to what I feel and I believe. And I'm sure the audience here are very much in line with what you just said. It's very sad that our modern mind isn't about collective minds. It's about all specialized. And we had a tentative conversation between you and I a few days back that we are so focused that we don't see the whole thing. There's that image of a building and an image of a old stone corridor and sideways views and not focus is very important. And the subtlety of all those things in our understanding of architecture is so important. I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I should caution you that in this lecture it sounds like it's very clear and sorted out in my mind, but it's actually still a sort of very intense struggle. And when I started down this road to try and redefine what practice had to be, I found that the greatest problem was my own conditioning, that I had not been trained with even a language to think this way. And even now, I mean, I'm trying to apply it as treating my practice as a sort of living laboratory where I can experiment. And some things are working very well, but some things are still quite chaotic. So I think one is still sort of struggling with this. So if I come, it will just be to share the struggle. In a way, but in a way, it is that sharing of the struggle, and it's really not seeing the whole, but accepting that you can't see the whole, and then saying, then how does my consciousness participate in a holistic manner, knowing that I will never see the whole. Whereas the way we are trained is to believe that what we can see is the whole, and that's what one has to change. And to also accept that it's non-linear, so I can't control outcomes perfectly. So I can just start something, and so I've had to accept certain things, for example, in the way I run my practice, because there are so many people, and we're like a bit like 8 small offices under one roof. And I look at what comes out, and I have to accept the fact that, okay, that would have been very different if I hadn't been there, but I can't say I did that. And it took some effort to come to that acceptance. I think what you have said also of, the way of seeing, there's another important point that is to be made in today's world, and this is something I read in an issue of El Croquis magazine, which was on the Dutch firm MVRDV. And there's an essay there which is called the redefinition of radicalism. And they said that earlier, to be radical, you had a certain, you put forward a philosophy, and there were certain day-to-day protocols that you worked with which were treated as more private, and you sort of hid them from you. But now philosophy has become more questionable, so it's retreated to the background, and the computer has allowed day-to-day protocols to have a very seductive imagery, and that has come to the foreground. But I think there is a problem when you look at those kind of computerized sort of formalism, algorithm or parametric development of form as the primary thing that you foreground, which unfortunately has become too predominant in today's architectural discourse. And we need more of those private protocols that depend on your bodily cognition, on muscle memory, like the sketchbooks you are so much a part of you. I think that's an aspect also that needs to be brought into the way we are teaching a lot more.
We might take one more question if we have.
I'll go for the last one. Well, thank you, Prem. We covered a lot of grounds, first of all. I'm wondering where one can enter, because we could spend another hour picking on different things. Well, you ended with mystery, meaning, that the role of mystery. And one would have liked that the mystery was clarified. It wasn't, it was deepened. That's perhaps a good thing. And that's perhaps a good thing, that the mystery was deepened. I was wondering that, well, first of all, we are not termites. And also we are termites. I mean, we are not termites in the sense that literally we are not tracking traces, but then we must. But then also as humans, we are also, as the term goes, the organizational man. Thinking of the Japanese labor force, the office force. So I was wondering whether the architect now should be a mountain climber or a sailor, as you put it. Are those the two options? Listening to it seems the preference would be to be the sailor, to go with the wind. But then architects must be also an architecture of resistance, which has been talked about quite a bit, that one must resist being the organization man, to be with the flow. What kind of flow are we talking about? I mean, being a sailor is a different kind of flow, the flow of the universe, if you like, the wind. But then there is the sort of the flow of how social organizations have come to be, which is another force, and which then must also be resisted, and not by the glorified architect, but at sort of every small process and way. So is there a sort of a third option here, than not only a mountain climber or a sailor, perhaps something else? Architecture, the practice of architecture as a resistance.
Okay, there are many questions within that question. It's not, I mean, these are two metaphors which sort of describe two attitudes that, and it's not to say that you're never a mountain climber. I mean, there is a lot of what you do that is, I mean, the rigorous repetitive practice that the craftsman does in some ways, is very mountain climber. There's a lot of hard work involved. But eventually your sort of worldview of what your reason for being is, do you expect it just to be on your own power, or do you also rely on your on an external power, the grace, the wind, or the metaphor of the sailboat? Now, reliance on the wider power does not mean that you have no individual will. It's not saying that. It's saying that what you're seeking is harmony rather than understanding. You accept the fact that you can't see the whole, but you seek that level of harmony, and you seek a level of understanding so that you're not just driven by your sensory perceptions, but you're seeing something more than that. I think the organization man sees things within a sort of very narrow perspective and then just marches to the beat of the drum. So it's also being aware of how that external power lives within you. It's not just the external power. It's you and that are actually the same. I don't know if I'm really answering your question completely, but that way of discovery actually comes through a certain level of perseverance. One of the examples which I quoted in the seminar was of a musician in Pune called Pushkar Lele, who had been learning from a young age for about 15 years, but then he reached a plateau where he felt he was not progressing further, and felt that to move to the next level, he needed a new guru. So he started training under a teacher called Vijay Sadeshmukh. And he first thought that Sadeshmukh would reveal to him the keys of this higher kingdom. And Sadeshmukh actually pushed him back to basics and said, for the next 6 months, you sing just one note, sa, or shadaj, as it's called, for 8 hours a day. So he thought that was a rather boring and pedantic thing to do, but in the tradition, you have to listen to what the guru says, so he did it. And he said one day he sang the sa his guru was looking for, and the guru smiled. And he said, I realized that till then I had never hit the exact center of a note before. So there was all that hard work of working for 6 months, just doing this sort of repetitive thing, but you do it with a faith that this moment of epiphany comes, and that then you realize that there is an external power and that music is something greater than you are. And you are actually learning how to harmonize with it, so you inhabit it with that degree of exactitude that shows this understanding. And after that, once you've reached that, then you're allowing the power of music to fill, to be the wind in your sails. So it's not saying, and that has to be a unique and personal understanding that has to be born within you. What happens with that mythical imagination is actually when the universal is reborn in the unique every moment. And that's when you feel what Campbell refers to as the rapture of being alive. So it's that connection that you're seeking between the universal and the unique. If you are the unique person, but you're seeking to embody the universal and harmonize with it and be one with it. So I think the organization man is actually something very different. We are different from termites in the sense we think, and we have a consciousness. We have a reflexive consciousness, which termites don't have. And that makes a big difference. But it's really just the immersion in this process to eventually seek this way of understanding, which is very different from the ways of intellectual understanding that we tend to be schooled in. It's a way of learning by doing rather than learning by understanding.
One thing that, there are many things that you have brought up which I think I would request the audience to reflect upon slowly, gradually. But one thing is about rhythm, and you may have used other terms to talk about that, repetition, but it's not quite repetition, but perhaps a more powerful way to talk about it is rhythm. And you just mentioned about music, about sound, and about the body. And I think what makes the body so, the human body, or perhaps any animate object, is the breathing, the rhythm that comes from it. And we have forgotten that. We live with it because that makes us alive, but we consciously don't allow ourselves to reflect on it. What Andre Lefebvre reminds me and us, and I would like everyone to think about it, because in the making of architecture, not in the practice of architecture, but I think the beautiful way to think about it is doing architecture, making architecture, as a craftsman would do. It's rhythm. So it's not about spatial analysis. That's what we do in architecture studios. What Lefebvre wanted us to think about is rhythm analysis. Can we find a model, a method, a process to consciously, reflectively bring rhythm analysis in our doing and making?
Yeah, the phrase I like to use on that is that we are trained in an aesthetics of expression. That is, what do I have to say, what do I have to create to make the work meaningful? But actually, what happens in real life is we hand the work over for inhabitation. And there's a process of inhabitation and a dialogue between the inhabitant and the aura that over time breeds memory, and that makes the work meaningful. So I think there's also an aesthetic of absorption, and we're not trained to think about that, and that's something we should think about, and that would get closer to what Lefebvre was talking about in rhythm analysis.
Okay, we have our audio. Thank you. Thanks, Prem Chandavarkar. And we also have Nina Chandavarkar also among us. Just give a hand for her as well. She also She is a landscape architect, graduated from UPenn and now practicing in Bangalore. She also gave some lecture at our workshop. So that would be the end of our workshop and classes and the public lecture together. Come here again on Saturday. So we have another public lecture with Seksan. He is one of the prominent architects from Malaysia, and very eclectic and in his own way. He's more specialized in landscape designing and from engineering background. So we look forward to see you again here on Saturday, same time, 6:30. Thank you and good night.